In a time when the heavens were untouchable, when stars were thought to be perfect and still, when Earth was the unmoving center of all creation, a man dared to lift a lens to the sky and say, "No, the universe is not what we think." That man was Galileo Galilei, born in Pisa in 1564. The same year Michelangelo died and Shakespeare was born. He arrived into a world still chained to the ideas of Aristotle and Ptolemy, where questioning the cosmos was not just scientific rebellion, it was heresy. As a child, Galileo showed promise, not just in science, but in music and art. His father, a music theorist, encouraged critical thinking, even skepticism, planting in his son the seeds of intellectual defiance. Originally pushed toward medicine, Galileo was bored by the rote memorization of university lectures. It was the elegance of mathematics and the movement of pendulums that captured his mind. He began asking questions that others avoided. Why do objects fall? How does motion work? Could the heavens be subject to the same rules as the earth? By the age of 25, Galileo was already pushing boundaries. He created mechanical devices, studied motion with ramps and inclined planes, and began building a reputation as a mathematical rebel. But it was in 1609, when he heard about a new invention from the Netherlands, a spyglass, that Galileo's life and legacy would change forever. He did not merely replicate the telescope, he improved it, enhanced it, made it powerful enough to peer deeper into space than anyone before him. And what he saw would shake the foundations of human belief. Galileo turned his telescope toward the moon and, instead of a smooth, heavenly sphere, he saw mountains, craters, valleys. The moon was flawed, imperfect, like Earth. He turned it to Jupiter and discovered 4 moons orbiting it. Churches believed that everything in the universe revolved around Earth. He observed the phases of Venus, the sunspots on the sun, and rings around Saturn. He documented it all meticulously and published what he saw. Suddenly, the cosmos wasn't static. It wasn't perfect. It was dynamic, evolving, and governed by natural laws. Galileo's findings supported the ideas of Copernicus, who decades earlier had suggested that the sun, not the Earth, was at the center of the solar system. But Copernicus had been cautious. Galileo was not. In 1610, he published Sidereus Nunciesta Stari Messinera, book that not only shared his discoveries but challenged the very worldview endorsed by the Church. He became famous almost overnight, courted by nobility, praised by scholars, and loathed by the Jesuits admired his brilliance, but warned him to tread carefully. The Church was powerful, its doctrines absolute, and Galileo was now walking a razor's edge. But Galileo was not a man of subtlety. He was bold, often arrogant, and unafraid to ridicule those who disagreed with him. In 1632, he published Dialogue concerning the 2 chief world systems, a book written as a debate between a Copernican and a Ptolemaic thinker. But the character defending Earth-centered views was named Simplicio, a thinly veiled insult. Worse, many interpreted Simplicio as a stand-in for Pope Urban VIII, who had once been Galileo's ally. The Pope felt betrayed, the Church was humiliated, the Inquisition was summoned. In 1633, Galileo, the father of modern science, was forced to stand trial for heresy. Old, frail, and nearly blind, he was interrogated for weeks. They showed him the instruments of torture. They offered him one choice: recant his belief that the earth moves around the sun, or face imprisonment or worse. He recanted publicly, though legend holds, he muttered under his breath, "Hyper se mueve," and yet it moves. Whether he said it or not, his ideas could not be silenced. He was sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life. And yet, even confined, Galileo continued to write, to explore, to think. In isolation, he penned discourses and mathematical demonstrations relating to 2 new sciences, laying the groundwork for physics, motion, and strength of materials. His mind never stopped. Though the world tried to muzzle him, his intellect refused to fade. He died in 1642, under house arrest, his body weak but his legacy unstoppable. Ironically, the same year Isaac Newton was born, the man who would stand on Galileo's shoulders and revolutionize science further. The Church buried Galileo in a small room, away from glory, refusing him the honor he deserved. But time would do what power could not. Nearly 100 years later, Galileo's body was moved to a grand tomb in Florence, just opposite Michelangelo's. And in 1992 to 350 years after his trial, the Vatican officially acknowledged the Church's error. Today, Galileo is celebrated as the father of modern science, the man who dared to question dogma, who refused to close his eyes to the evidence, and who suffered for truth. But in his own time, he was branded dangerous, heretical, because madness, often, is just genius, seen through the lens of fear. He did not invent the telescope, but he made the world see with new eyes. He did not conquer nations, but he conquered ignorance. Galileo Galilei taught us, not just to look up but to ask what we see, and never settle for the answers we're told to believe. He lived in a universe full of silence and forced obedience, but he chose to listen to the stars instead. And in doing so, he cracked open the heavens. not with a sword, but with a lens end, gave humanity its first real glimpse into the infinite. In the quiet corridors of a 19th-century Augustinian monastery nestled in the sleepy town of Brno, in what is now the Czech Republic, a bearded monk walked daily through his garden, his hands stained with pollen, his eyes fixated not on the heavens or the stars like Galileo or Tesla, but on peas, ordinary green peas. It seemed absurd, even laughable, that such a small focus, so humble and quiet, could one day unravel the most profound mystery of human existence: heredity. His name was Gregor Mendel, and while the world around him thundered with revolutions, wars, and the rise of industrial machines, he tended to his plants like a man on a sacred mission. Born in 1822 to a poor farming family, Mendel's intellect was obvious from a young age, but poverty pressed on him like a weight. He studied as much as he could, often going hungry just to afford tuition, eventually joining the Augustinian order, not only out of faith but because the monastery offered what his family could not access: to books, stability, and the time to think. Behind monastery walls, he studied mathematics, physics, and biology, disciplines most thought separate but which he saw as threads of one tapestry. He wasn't a great teacher. His nerves often betrayed him in front of a classroom, leading to multiple failures in certification exams. But he had something more powerful than public charisma. He had patience, precision, and a mind obsessed with patterns. Where others saw randomness in inheritance, he suspected law. Where others saw chaos in how traits passed from parent to child, he suspected order. And so, in the privacy of his monastery garden, away from fame, funding, or even encouragement, Mendel began the most important experiment in the history of biology. Using pea plants, he bred generation after generation over 30,000 plants, meticulously recording which traits appeared, disappeared, and reappeared. He studied flower, color, seed shape, pod texture, and plant height, and slowly, a mathematical pattern emerged: a 3-to-1 ratio in the second generation. He realized that traits were not blended or diluted, as was commonly believed, but inherited as distinct units, what he called factors, what we now call genes. He discovered dominant and recessive traits, independent assortment, and the basic laws of heredity, all without a microscope, without knowledge of DNA, without any support from the outside world. In 1866, he published his findings in a modest scientific journal with a circulation of barely 100 copies, and then nothing. The world ignored him. His peers didn't understand his statistical approach. Leading biologists of the day dismissed him. Charles Darwin, who was grappling with the question of inheritance himself, never saw the paper. Mendel sent copies to famous scientists across Europe. Few even bothered to respond. His work was too mathematical for biologists, too biological for mathematicians. It existed in a scientific no-man's land, and Mendel, ever modest, ever faithful, did not push. He returned to monastery duties, became abbot, and administrative responsibilities consumed his time. He never did another major experiment. He died in 1884, largely unknown, remembered mostly by fellow monks for his kind demeanor, quiet wisdom, and oddly obsessive interest in peas. But science has a strange way of resurrecting the forgotten. At the dawn of the 20th century, as the study of heredity became a burning question in science, 3 separate scientists, Hugo de Vries, Karl Koch, and Erich von Schirmachen, dependently rediscovered Mendel's work. When they did, it was like a thunderclap across the scientific world. What had once been obscure was now obvious. What had once been dismissed was now revolutionary. The laws Mendel had quietly scribbled decades earlier in his notebooks were suddenly the foundation of a brand new science, genetics. He became, posthumously, universities named departments after him. Statues were built. The term Mendelian inheritance became a standard in biology textbooks. His laws helped unravel the secrets of DNA, led to the mapping of the human genome, and empowered modern medicine, agriculture, and evolutionary theory. He is now rightly called the father of genetics, but during his lifetime, he was no one's father, just a quiet monk lost in thought, more familiar with petals than people, more fluent in cross-pollination than conversation, and yet, perhaps that anonymity was his strength. In the noise of public debate and the hunger for glory, it's easy to chase fame and lose focus. Mendel chased no fame. He simply wanted to know how life passed from one form to another. He believed, almost religiously, in order beneath the surface, in divine structure, in nature's chaos, and while the world spun around him fast as trains, new scientific squabbles, he knelt before the lowly pea plant and saw something no one else had. He didn't just plant seeds in soil, he planted the seeds of a scientific revolution. He didn't just observe inheritance, he decoded it. Today, we sequence genes, manipulate genomes, cure diseases, and clone animals, all on the back of that forgotten monk's garden experiments. It's a reminder that science isn't always thunder and spectacle. Sometimes it is silence. Sometimes it is solitude. Sometimes it is a man in a garden, watching flowers bloom and fall, and seeing in that cycle the future of all life on Earth. Mendel died believing he had failed. The irony is almost unbearable, because his so-called failure became one of the greatest successes in scientific history. He once wrote, "My scientific studies have afforded me great gratification, and I am convinced that it will not be long before the whole world acknowledges the results of my work." It took decades, but the world did acknowledge. And now, the name Mendel is immortal not because he shouted, but because he listened closely enough to hear the whisper of life's most secret code. In a small village in what is now Croatia, during a thunderstorm in 1856, a boy was born at the stroke of midnight. The midwife called it an omen. She said he would be a child of darkness. His mother, however, replied, "No, he will be a child of light." That boy was Nikola Tesla, a name that would one day become synonymous with electricity, genius, and madness. Tesla was not like other boys. By the time he was a teenager, he could memorize entire books and solve advanced calculus problems in his head. He claimed he had visions, blinding flashes of light that brought him inspiration, but also torment. He saw inventions before he built them, turning over every bolt, every circuit in his mind before ever touching a tool. He spoke 8 languages, slept barely 2 hours a night, and walked 12 miles a day to clear his head. He was a man who lived not in the world as it was, but in the world as it could be. Tesla left for America in 1884 with little more than a letter of introduction to Thomas Edison, who was already a celebrity for creating the phonograph and a working electric light bulb. The two men could not have been more different. Edison was practical, commercially minded, a showmind. Tesla was an idealist, a purist of science, almost allergic to business. When Tesla arrived, Edison allegedly offered him $50,000 to improve his direct current system. Tesla did, but when he asked for the money, Edison laughed and told him it was a joke. Betrayed and broke, Tesla quit. He worked manual labor digging ditches for $2 a day just to survive. But this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far greater. Tesla secured backing for his own electric system, alternating current, or a sea which could transmit electricity over vast distances efficiently. It was elegant, powerful, and dangerous. Edison fought him hard, launching a smear campaign to prove AC was lethal. He electrocuted animals in public demonstrations, even filmed the electrocution of an elephant to terrify the public. Tesla, on the other hand, responded with science and spectacle. He lit lamps wirelessly from across a stage, made sparks jump from his fingers, and allowed currents to pass through his body without harm. He became a sensation. Eventually, Tesla's AC won the war of the currents. It powered the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, and later the Niagara Falls power plant, the first to deliver electricity to an entire city. For a brief moment, Nikola Tesla was a star, but Tesla wasn't satisfied. While others sought patents, profits, and power, Tesla dreamed of revolution. He envisioned wireless communication before radios existed. He claimed he could harness free energy from the earth and broadcast it to the entire globe. With backing from J.P. Morgan, he began work on Wardenclyffe Tower, an enormous structure on Long Island designed to send wireless energy across the Atlantic. But when Morgan realized Tesla couldn't monetize the project, he pulled the funding. Tesla was left bankrupt, his tower dismantled, his name fading. He became reclusive, talking to pigeons in New York parks and living in hotels he couldn't afford. He spoke of death rays and interplanetary communication, and the press labeled him a mad scientist. They weren't entirely wrong. Tesla had grown erratic, obsessively washing his hands, walking in precise numerical patterns, refusing to touch anything not divisible by 3. He claimed to receive signals from Mars, spoke of otherworldly visitors, and became increasingly isolated. Yet, even as he slipped further from society, his mind remained brilliant. He dreamed of machines that could cause earthquakes, aircraft that could take off vertically, and a world lit without wires. Much of what he imagined was later proven possible. But he was too far ahead. The world was not ready for Tesla. In 1943, he died alone in room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel, broken, forgotten, with only his pigeons for company. The FBI confiscated his papers. Rumors swirled for decades. Some said they contained designs for weapons, others said they outlined a system of unlimited energy. Most of his notes were never recovered. Tesla was buried with little fanfare. It took decades for the world to realize what it had lost. Today, Tesla is a cultural icon. His name powers a car company. His inventions fuel our cities. His visions laid groundwork for radio, radar, remote control, robotics, and wireless communication. He is now recognized not just as a scientist, but as a prophet of the modern age. Yet the tragedy remains: he was a man who gave the world the future, but lived as though he didn't belong in the present. He burned with a light so brilliant that it blinded those around him. And in the end, like many who carry the fire of genius, Nikola Tesla was left to flicker out in solitude, his dreams still echoing in the circuits and wires of the 21st century. He once said, "The present is theirs. The future, for which I really worked, is mine." And indeed, the future turned out to be his all along. In the shadowy halls of 19th-century hospitals, where pain echoed and the stench of decay lingered like a curse, where women cried out in labor, and too often died shortly after in agony, one man looked around and saw a paterna horror that no one else dared admit, and tried to stop it with the simplest of actions: washing hands. His name was Ignaz Semmelweis, born in 1818 in Budapest, Hungary, in a world still teetering between medieval superstition and modern science, a world where doctors went from autopsies to childbirth without so much as rinsing their fingers, where the blood of the dead mixed with the breath of the living, and where the very act of being treated by a physician could be a death sentence. Semmelweis was no rebel by design. He was the fifth of 10 children, a man of intellect and focus, who rose through Vienna's elite medical ranks with the sharp mind of a surgeon and the quiet rigor of a mathematician. He studied law first, then switched to medicine, as if drawn by some unseen force toward a battlefield where his life would be waged not with bullets, but with soap. When he began working at the Vienna General Hospital's obstetrics clinic, a deadly mystery awaited him. The hospital had 2 maternity wards, one staffed by doctors and medical students, the other by midwives. The women were assigned alternately, every other day, and yet the statistics were damning and undeniable. The death rate in the doctor's ward was 5 times higher. Women feared it. Some begged to be admitted on midwife days. Others gave birth in the streets to avoid the clinic entirely. The cause? Puerperal fever A. Semmelweis, driven by logic and compassion, became obsessed. He scoured every difference between the wards, same techniques, same beds, same protocols, and then, in 1847, a tragedy brought clarity. His friend, a pathologist, was accidentally pricked with a scalpel during an autopsy and died with the same symptoms as the women. That's when the impossible truth struck him. The doctors himself included were carrying death on their hands, from cadavers to patients. In a time before germ theory, bacteria, or antiseptic knowledge, this conclusion was revolutionary, heretical even. Semmelweis ordered that all medical students and physicians wash their hands in a chlorinated lime solution before examining patients. The results were immediate and miraculous. The death rate in the doctor's ward plummeted from over 18% to less than 2%. The hospital had never seen anything like it. He had solved the riddle. He had saved lives. He had stopped the silent killer. And yet, his reward was not applause, it was outrage. The medical community turned on him. Doctors refused to believe they were the problem. The idea that they respected men of science who were infecting women with their own filthy hands was not just insulting. It was inconceivable. His methods were called unscientific, his results a fluke. His insistence grew desperate. He wrote papers, letters, open appeals. He lashed out at colleagues, calling them murderers by negligence. His passion, once noble, turned fiery and combative. He was not a diplomat. He had no patience for egos, and egos are what he faced. He was eventually forced out of the hospital. Other institutions refused to adopt his methods. Even after proving, again and again, that hand-washing worked, he remained a pariah. His career crumbled. He returned to Hungary, continuing his work with moderate success, but the flame of recognition never reignited. He published a book, The Etiology Concept and Prophylaxis of Childbed Fever, a dense, emotional plea for reform, but it was met with silence. Critics dismissed him. Friends abandoned him. And slowly, Ignaz Semmelweis descended into a private hell. He became erratic, paranoid, shouting in the streets about the needless deaths of mothers, accusing the entire medical profession of murder. His behavior worsened. Some believe he suffered from Alzheimer's or nerve. In 1865, at the age of 47, his own family had him committed to an asylum. There, in a cruel twist of fate, he was beaten by guards, neglected, and died just 2 weeks later from a gangrenous wound killed by an infection. The very thing he had spent his life trying to prevent. The world moved on. Louis Pasteur would later prove germ theory. Joseph Lister would champion antiseptics. And slowly, hand hygiene became the cornerstone of modern medicine. But Semmelweis remained a footnote, his name whispered only among scholars, his truth buried with him until the 20th century, when historians and physicians began to look back with horror and awe, realizing what had been ignored. Today, Ignaz Semmelweis is hailed as the savior of mothers, a martyr of science, a man who saw the truth when no one else could. Statues bear his name. Hospitals honor his memory. Entire medical protocols are rooted in his lonely crusade. And yet, his story is a haunting reminder of science's deepest flaw, not ignorance, but arrogance. He wasn't undone by failure, but by being right too soon. He wasn't dismissed for lack of evidence, but for wounding pride. His madness was not madness at all, but clarity in a world too blind to see. And in that truth lies the tragedy. Thousands died who could have lived, not because the cure wasn't known, but because the man who found it was silenced. Semmelweis once wrote, "When I look back upon the past, I can only dispel the sadness which falls upon me by gazing into that happy future when the infection will be banished." That future came, too late for so many. Yet we remember now, because in his pain lies our progress, and in his silence, the roar of every saved life still echoes.